What makes an anime worth watching? Engaging story, memorable characters, thoughtful theming, spellbinding setting, awesome artwork, exciting animation, sumptuous sound design, or perhaps that implacable resonance one might share with the creator's vision? Any of those may be a good enough reason to tune in, but what happens when a series has none of these things going for it? Apparently it gets an 8.5 on Mal. Y'all must have really liked that soundtrack. Shin Sekai Yori is the Japanese translated title of Antonin Dvorak's Symphony No. 9, also known as From the New World. Though inevitably the title makes me think of Aldous Huxley's massively influential dystopian novel Brave New World, the playbook from which so many sci-fi stories have borrowed that it's hard to know which were influenced by it directly and which were influenced by things it influenced. In the case of Shin Sekai Yori though, it's not just the setting and title bearing similarity, but the thought process which seems to lie at the heart of its creation. Aldous Huxley was an Englishman who lived in Hollywood for a while and then imagined a horrifying future wherein American capitalism had gone way too far. Henry Ford was worshipped as a god, everyone flew around in helicopters and replaced their clothes constantly, had random loveless sex, and no concept of family. In this society, everyone was a test tube baby, genetically modified and psychologically conditioned to occupy a certain station in society, which is also true of the world in Shin Sekai Yori. If Brave New World was a dystopia built on the worst of American values, Shin Sekai Yori is one built on the worst of Japanese values. It is meant to criticize Japan's culture of defeatism, with one of its most dramatic moments coming when the leader of a community throws up her hands and says, "It can't be helped," followed by sad music.
今すぐ何らかの手を打たないと。
打つ手はないのよ。
If you watch enough anime, you've seen this countered a billion times. In 2014, I wrote about how the thematic backbone of Samurai Champloo, for instance, was to counter this culture of defeatism by celebrating Japan's capability of mutating their culture through outside influence. Yokohama Shopping Log, on the other hand, is a quiet, meditative look at that society in a post-apocalyptic world wherein they've decided to quietly allow themselves to fade away. Perhaps the most uniquely captivating aspect of Shin Sekai Yori is the presentation of a future dystopia fashioned after a Japanese mountain village. The 1,000 years of change which brought us here began when a new evolutionary stage of psychic children emerged, a concept which Japanese culture has been consistently obsessed with since becoming a world power on the basis of their standing at the forefront of technological development, as well as their history marred by so many mutated humans in the wake of the nuclear apocalypse, which they are the only country to have embedded in their cultural memory. Psychic powers are even stronger and scarier than nuclear bombs in this universe, and the ensuing wars fought with them reduced the population to 2% of what it used to be. A few dark dynasties later, and humans eventually figured out that the only way they were going to get a handle on this shit was by creating a culture of love, wherein no one felt the need to go on homicidal rampages anymore. And they achieved this through genetic manipulation and psychological conditioning. Sounds like a pretty cool idea for a sci-fi setting. It's too bad they dropped the ball completely when developing its backstory. The central conceit here is that they figured out how to modify the human genome so that if someone were to kill another person, they would immediately experience a death of shame. On top of that, to make sure no one reaches that point in the first place, they're conditioned from birth to learn stress and power management and are given a place in society. Mission complete. Except that some kids, labeled ogres, are able to bypass the death of shame and murder freely, while others whose powers are so strong that they just leak out of their subconscious and fuck everything up are called karmic demons, and generally both have to be put down. Had it been revealed that either of these were simply unavoidable genetic conditions which society had no way of dealing with, it would have made sense that from the emergence of these conditions, society's oppressive fear of nuclear sociopaths would lead to the present situation, wherein children are heavily monitored and conditioned up through age 17, with any suspected of being potential ogres or karmic demons being culled along the way. But that isn't how things are explained. When the village elder tells her story of witnessing an ogre in the past, it is suggested that the fact that his mother was a part of the administration bureau had put him under an abnormal amount of stress, which in a system wherein the whole point is to condition kids not to feel stress means that he was conditioned incorrectly. In a society supposedly built around having a strong enough understanding of psychology to thoroughly condition the minds of its populace, it would have been obvious to anyone that this divergence in the child's upbringing was the cause of his ability to bypass the death of shame. Yet this detail is only mentioned in passing as a possible cause, which somehow no one considered when making decisions about how to deal with ogres from then on.
Everything he said was either cruel or twisted.
I wouldn't worry about it. It sounds like he's just suffering from a bit of stress.
But for some reason, no one seemed to be very worried about how abnormal he was. But for some reason, no one seemed to be very worried about how abnormal he was. But for some reason, no one seemed to be very worried about how abnormal he was.
In fact, even after this is explained, our protagonist Saki takes it as a revelation that changes in mental conditioning will affect how the death of shame works. When the final battle of the series revolves around a little girl with ogre powers who is raised by mutant rat men, we'll get to them later, being tricked into killing one and thus experiencing death of shame because she thinks she's killed one of her own, it is suggested that we shouldn't have seen this coming. So if no one else has picked up on this in the 200 years since implementing this system, including the village chief who's been alive for all of it, then why is Saki uniquely able to draw this conclusion? I mean, they did decide to keep her alive for a decade in spite of having learned many forbidden truths and broken tons of rules because they saw potential in her to be the next leader. So what is it about this girl that makes her so special that she can recognize the truth about ogres which no one else could? Well, she's brave. That's it. She's just super duper brave. That's the explanation we get. Why is Saki so brave? I have no idea. Nothing about her upbringing is shown to be especially different. It's sorta suggested that her mother is also really brave, I guess? Maybe Saki is just genetically predisposed to being the most brave human there is. Nothing about this is ever clarified. She just is brave, and therefore, unlike everyone else in a society operating on the understanding that we need to keep people from feeling stressed and out of place, she recognizes that ogres are just people who feel stressed and out of place. Checks out to me. Had it been revealed that ogres and karmic demons were genetic anomalies which no one knew how to deal with because their psychology was fundamentally different, and the revelation had been that they needed a different kind of mental health paradigm in order to manage them, then we could have had an interesting story. And for what it's worth, I think that's what they were trying to say about this kid. They just fucked it up by then revealing he was also super stressed out for perfectly normal reasons. For instance, let's imagine if the sexual contact which everyone uses to calm their emotions didn't work on one kid because he was asexual. They had the opportunity to set this up with Shun, who rejects the sexual advances of his friends and insists that he wants to be alone. But it turns out that's just because he's scared of hurting people with his out-of-control karmic demon powers and has nothing to do with his sexuality, since he's in love with Saki anyways. But had he been asexual, we could have had an arc about how different humans have different needs to be fulfilled in order to feel satisfied within society, and how feeling othered on the basis of your genetic differences causes stress in itself. And considering that the society already does for the most part embrace the idea that everyone is unique in some way, we could have had Saki try to find a paradigm for this character to function and feel accepted therein. Instead, in the cases we see of characters turning into ogres or karmic demons, it is suggested that this was the result of having too much pressure placed on them, something which the society is entirely based around preventing. Shun's power leaks out of his subconscious because there's such a high expectation placed on him to be the most badass psychic around that he feels incapable of just being a regular person like his friends. This is such an easy psychological hang-up to understand that the author of Shin Sekai Yori understood it, but apparently nobody in the society built around managing stress did. It's pretty obvious that this is meant to be a statement about the Japanese school system driving children to suicide, except that the Japanese school system isn't based around managing children psychologically. If it were, it wouldn't have this problem. Before we continue, let's take a moment to talk about Psychopaths, which comes up in every conversation about this show. Psychopaths is also set in a dystopian society built around the concept of stress management, but while servicing a much larger population with a much more diverse range of people and far more cracks in the overhead. Early into the series, Tsunemori Akane, who understands the system better than anyone and is also best able to function within it pretty much just because she's super brave, though in this case her extreme type A personality, studiousness, and long-standing interest in the theory behind the system makes that believable, comes to recognize that the system is not objectively correct as it purports to be when a candidate for lethal elimination is able to be talked down from her manic state. Over the course of the series, we are made to understand that the system is indeed extremely fallible, with tons of people falling through the cracks, because the entire thing is based on a foundation of lies. In order to make people accept the Sybil system, the literal brains behind it had to convince them that they were able to objectively qualify a person's criminality. And since for the bulk of the bell curve, this system is legitimately capable of giving them access to a more fulfilling life than what previous societies allowed for, the populace has given total control to the system. For those who don't quite fit in, there's extreme anti-stress drugs, and for those who extra don't fit in, there's correctional facilities. But go too far and you're a goner. It makes sense for the Sybil system to operate this way because the truth is that it's just a hive mind of the most genetically divergent brains forming a net of unified perspective with which to understand as many people as possible. But their knowledge is always going to be incomplete because everyone is at least somewhat unique. In order to improve itself, the system continually recruits the brains of people so mentally divergent that their system isn't even able to scan them, while allowing those who are just divergent enough to fall through the cracks but not enough to offer them a lot of new information to simply die. The flaw of the Sybil system is arrogance. This cabal of brains have decided that they know what's best for society and are managing it on their own terms, expecting that they can eventually achieve perfection, even though they're really just casting judgment and deciding what's right for themselves instead of allowing the populace to continue evolving and to develop new paradigms which may be even more successful than theirs, which Akane pledges to continue the search for while dedicating herself to working within the system to help as many individuals as she can to cope with their place therein. Psychopaths' setting is convincing because it is nuanced. The Sybil system has legitimately made life better for the majority of people, but we spend a lot of time exploring all the specific ways that it fails for individual outliers, or can be duped by recognizing the flaws in its logic. In the process, many intuitive and plausible futuristic technologies are presented which make it apparent how people would feel satisfied enough in this world to buy into its governance. I won't say that it's the most perfectly built sci-fi world in existence, but it has a lot to offer for consideration of humanity's near future and how things could simultaneously get better and worse depending on your personality and perspective. Now let's have a look at Shin Sekai Yori's setting. In this world, humanity has been minimized to the scale of small Japanese villages resembling the tail end of the 1800s. As a visual shorthand for establishing the decline in population and the priorities of the society, it is clever, but we're never really given an explanation for why technology, or more importantly, aesthetics, have regressed in this way. It isn't until the last third of the series that we actually venture into the town where it takes place, but it seems to be no different from an old Japanese city. The summer festival is the same as it is today, in spite of 1,000 years of shifting dynasties having controlled this region and there being no evidence of meaningful cultural connection between the old world and this one. For reasons not explained, at least in the TV series, humans have abandoned forms of energy generation more advanced than water wheels, which assumably is why they don't live in steel buildings or drive cars. Although their psychic powers are also capable of generating fire and seemingly infinite energy, so like, why don't they just use their powers to power things? Half of their education seems to be about learning to control their powers to do stuff like levitate or make mirrors and shit, but apparently their town can't do light bulbs because they don't have enough power generators. But then at one point a guy literally charges a battery by generating electricity. I want to assume that this is explored further in the original novel, since the idea is floated several times that Saki, as the future leader of this community, will somehow find a way to advance its technology, and then it's never mentioned again. But I never understood how these people seemingly don't understand technology to begin with, even though there's a fair deal of weird future shit which they do use, like these ugly silly-ass living library things that don't make any goddamn sense whatsoever, and oh my god, my brain is hemorrhaging. Somebody please explain the outfits in this show. What even are they, and why would they exist? They literally brought on a staff member specifically to do costume design, and every single episode they put the characters in new clothes with no apparent rhyme or reason. Despite the aesthetic of the village being specifically 1800s Japan, the outfits draw on all sorts of cultures throughout history. The school uniforms and Saki's ritual outfit in the first episode have clear purposes, but beyond that it's a total free-for-all, with outfits not even denoting anything about the characters' personalities, since none of them has a consistent personal aesthetic, much less one that complements their society. See Pantsu Party's video for a full breakdown of just how senseless the costume designs could get. Psychic powers are presented so loosely as to be incomprehensible. At times it's suggested that every kid manifests their powers differently or has some kind of specialty, with Satoru creating mirrors and Maria being way into levitation, but then for the most part everyone is just kind of presented as unstoppable gods. At one point in the second arc we see Saki flying, but then a few episodes later, when everyone's scouring the mountainside searching for their friend, only Maria uses her levitation powers, while everyone else is using psychically propelled skis. It kinda comes off like they just wanted to have psychically propelled skis in the show and forgot that those would be useless if everyone's supposed to be able to fly. Towards the end of the first arc, we witness psychics wrecking epic levels of destruction, splitting the earth entirely in two, tearing through armies with a thought, launching trees like missiles at specific enemies whom Satoru can apparently see from miles away, and generally wrecking havoc on the monster rats. Yet somehow in the final arc, the rats are able to totally lay waste to their village using ambush tactics? Excuse me, I thought that any one psychic was supposed to be powerful enough to take down an entire civilization, and that they didn't think of the monster rats as people. So how is it that the first time one of those rats killed a human, they didn't just eradicate every monster rat off the face of the earth in about 3 seconds by just imagining them gone? We witnessed a series of protracted battles for episodes on end wherein the humans are presented as vastly weaker and stupider than they had ever been before, so that the rats can dramatically slaughter them. Eventually, the staff must have caught on that this made no sense, so right after having one of the more powerful psychics finally decide to do what I just said, only after basically everyone's already dead, even though nothing has changed about his motivations or abilities from beforehand, they brought out the monster rat's trump card, a child raised from birth as an ogre. Because humans had taken to relying on the monster rats and impure cats, who by the way are just humans with no powers who had their genealogy spliced with similar-ish animals and were made subservient to humans, but nobody still alive knows that, as a means to dispose of scary children without experiencing the death of shame, and because ogres, having been allowed to run rampant with their powers, are just kinda stronger, there's no one who can stop this kid. However, the library tells of an ancient weapon used to combat ogres called the Psychobuster, a mystical item able to perish any living being, which is just literally anthrax. It's literally anthrax.
Virulent anthrax.
And apparently the only place you can find it is in a weird looking capsule somewhere in the ruins of Tokyo, which are now populated with all kinds of nuclear evolved Godzilla slimes or something. Why don't they have anthrax on hand, just in case this happens? When the village chief explains to Saki what happened when she witnessed an ogre 200 years ago, a doctor administers anthrax to the child in order to kill him. So how is it that within her extended lifetime, humans have just completely forgotten about and abandoned this method of dealing with ogres? Were they just so confident that the monster rats and impure cats were enough to do the job that they dumped all their anthrax? This entire society is founded on the fear of ogres, but they didn't try to keep a plan B on hand? We are presented with zero consequence or logic for why the adults of the village wouldn't all be carrying around Psychobusters at all times. After all, we witnessed several warriors willing to lay down their lives and experience the death of shame in order to protect the greater good, so it's not like they would have been scared to use it. God, I hate this show. Now Now bear in mind, I'm not someone who demands perfect logic from a story even if it is a serious plot-driven affair like Shin Sekai Yori, which goes so far as to never even feature an OP because this is the real shit, man. I mean, hell, the Dominators and Psychopaths make no goddamn sense. Like, how is this not obviously going to spike the stress level of anyone who sees it? I'm not gonna complain because it looks awesome, but it's definitely a stupid-ass style over substance decision. As we've already established though, for whatever minor logical problems that story might have, there's plenty of thematic intrigue to be mined from it. In Shin Sekai Yori's case, not only are the plot and themes horribly broken, but every other aspect of the show is utter dog shit. Should I start with the generic, lifeless character designs whose weird, vacuous eyes were my first deterrent from watching the show way back when it came out? Or how about the hideous artwork, animation, and storyboarding which made me originally drop the show halfway through the first episode? Or how about the bricks with faces whom I hesitate to consider characters that I couldn't connect with in any way at any point because they literally have no personalities whatsoever? Nah, it's all about the episode-long exposition dumps, which ensured I couldn't get past episode 4 when I tried to watch the show again years later after seeing it praised so highly, though notably not by anyone whose tastes I would actually take seriously. No joke, I have detailed every single relevant plot point in this entire show in the course of this video so far, aside from literally describing what happens to each of the characters. Honestly, I wish I'd saved myself 8 hours and just read the Wikipedia page, because I got as much out of that as I did out of the entire fucking show. Every arc is structured thusly. The main characters spend 3 or more episodes walking around looking for or running from something, while constantly speculating about the hidden meaning behind what they're seeing. Then at the end of the arc, there's an episode-spanning conversation, literally just confirming all the shit that was already suggested in the previous episodes. Each of these is presented like some kind of big twist, in spite of the fact that at no point is anything talked about not explicitly suggested in the episodes leading up to the reveal.
I had to run, I didn't want them to kill me.
For instance, in the first episode, the entire atmosphere of the show is dedicated to conveying this school as a mysterious dystopian setting with a hidden darkness. Everything the kids do and say is stilted and suggestive of some higher power holding them under careful control. It's clear that the bizarre school assignments they're given are testing them in some unknown way and that failure is unacceptable. But the obvious sixth wheel of the group is a total fuck up, and the ending of the episode explicitly suggests that they will be terminated. We get to episode 2 and that character is gone. This episode is entirely about this game where it's supposedly super important not to cheat, but one of the kids cheats anyways and no one in charge does anything about it even though it's obvious that it's happening. Once again, making it clear that the true intentions of the school are still mysterious. And then that kid disappears, so now we know that the real reason they didn't do anything about it is that the test wasn't really about winning so much as about making sure the kids wouldn't cheat. Fast forward 2 episodes and in the middle of literally 15 straight minutes of exposition, it is dramatically revealed that the truth is the school has been eliminating students the entire time. These tests were never really about grades, it was all just to make sure you could control your powers properly and aren't a sociopath. It's exactly what you thought! But this didn't bother me half as much as how most of the plot progression comes from characters just speculating about what's going on and then being right. For instance, in the first arc, Satoru and Saki are caught up in a battle between various tribes of monster rats, and eventually find themselves in the care of a clan which is supposedly the one most loyal to humanity. In spite of this tribe having helped them, Satoru jumps to the conclusion that because humans can't kill other humans without experiencing the death of shame, they probably use the monster rats to do their dirty work for them, which later in the show is going to be presented as a twist revelation. And since this tribe is super loyal to the village, they are probably going to kill the kids for having learned too much of the truth during the aforementioned exposition dump, even though as far as we know, the only one who knew about that was a monk who was previously killed in battle. So they get this monster rat named Squealer who had been helping them to guide them back to their canoes so they can escape the rats. But soon after rowing out, the rat tribe's boats are on their tails. The presentation of this whole subplot has constantly left it open to speculation whether Satoru is actually right to assume that the rats will kill them, so there's a little bit of tension over how they're going to get out of there. But then the screen cuts to black, and it turns out that the rats are helping them by towing their canoes back to the village. So I guess the kids were just being silly and jumping to conclusions, right? Except that afterwards, Taromaru asks them not to tell anyone about his helping them because he would be killed, causing the kids to once again just assume that they were right all along. This brand of storytelling infuriates me because it uses the fact that all of the conclusions drawn are speculative as a way to twist the narrative whichever way it wants without having to justify how it works, while leaving everything mysterious until the next reveal follows the consequences of whatever turned out to be true. Thankfully though, since I caught on to this in episode 7, I went the rest of the series just assuming that whatever the kids had assumed was going to be the truth, and that's exactly how the rest of the show went. Every single reveal was just a confirmation of things which had already been suggested.
I don't want my life to end before I can get any answers about this stupid world.
This all culminated into one of the trashiest scenes in TV anime history, and one that I'm absolutely shocked that so many people were willing to look past and giving the show a 10 out of 10. So halfway in, Shun becomes a karmic demon and nukes himself, and his memory is erased from the rest of the characters' minds. However, he continues to live on in the back of their subconscious, and eventually Saki's mental impression of him becomes strong enough that she can have conversations with him inside her own mind. Now, considering that none of the main characters who die ever do so on screen, the show obviously wants to keep the possibility open that any of them can come back. And since there was an entire fucking arc dedicated to the characters trying to bring back their memory of Shun, and to how Saki is half convinced he's still out there, it seems like the show is trying to build up to his comeback. So in the third to last episode, the main characters have been wandering these caves beneath the ruins of Tokyo trying to find the Psycho Buster. And right around the point when you're starting to think that if they spend one more episode in this fucking cave you're gonna lose your mind, Saki makes it to the surface, the music swells, we recap all these memories of her childhood, and then BAM! It's Shun! Finally! End of the episode. Keep in mind that from the time of his death up until this point, they've only ever shown Shun with a mask over his face and no one could remember his name, so they'd taken to calling him X. But now, Saki finally sees his face all grown up like she is and tearfully recalls his name. Wow, maybe the plot is about to finally start making progress towards its big dramatic finale. Nope, it was a fucking illusion. Literally right at the beginning of the next episode, it turns out that Saki was just seeing Taro Maru and I guess was so fucking excited, she mistook him for a complete reimagining of her childhood friend, and it was so convincing that she lifted the last of her mental blocks and remembered his name. What the fuck? And then they just go back into the cave and continue the plot like nothing happened. It was a straight up troll. Just a way to keep audiences hyped towards the end of the show when they knew we were going to be stuck in this cave for 5 whole fucking episodes. This is completely indefensible, and the fact that I've never seen it mentioned in the reviews that I've read is frankly embarrassing. While we're talking about that, let's touch on this whole final arc, because if you've heard anyone who likes this show talk about it, you've probably heard that the last 8 episodes are where it really picks up and gets good. But the only difference between these episodes and what came before is that people start dying. Like, a lot of people start dying, the majority of whom are either faceless villagers or a small cast of village leaders who were introduced just 2 episodes before this massacre began and have been shown exclusively in the context of a few boring-ass business meetings wherein they're all portrayed as comically inept and unfit to lead. Someone tell me how the fuck the guy who slams his fist on the table and screams at the mere suggestion that the festival be pushed back a few days to account for the suspicious monster rat activity didn't get culled by age 17. Is adulthood in this series just a metaphor for tenure? So everyone starts getting slaughtered, and it's exactly the same kind of goofy blood balloon bullshit that we got from Psychopaths 2.
ここで何をしてる？
お前は一体誰だ？誰だ？
If this kind of violence excites you, you're a fucking moron. I've seen the ending of this show compared to Shiki, and that is an insulting comparison. Aside from the fact that that entire show thematically built up to that point, all of the characters we watched die were nuanced and complete personalities, whom we'd seen develop over the entire show. Plus, many of them die in shocking, unique, or abjectly horrifying ways. In Shin Sekai Yori, we get blood piñatas and stock sound effects. Yeah, I'll admit there's a couple of solid tracks in the show's OST, but the overall sound design is butt awful. Which is apparent right from the start of episode 1, with all those generic squelching stock sounds that are somehow suggested to be how a human body would sound getting popped open. Meanwhile, here's a sound effect from Ava which makes every hair on my body stand up. Granted, the dead giveaway for me was when I heard one of those monster noises that I always recognize from my hundreds of hours of killing Boomas in Phantasy Star Online. I suppose I would be remiss if I didn't address Squealer before moving on, since so many of this show's fans seem to regard him as the best and most memorable character, some even going so far as to consider him the actual hero of the story. All that's unique about this character is that he believes in equal rights for all life forms and is trying to lead a revolution for the sake of Monster Rat independence. To this end, all we see of his character is him proselytizing the most basic morals which any fucking rational human on Earth would agree with, in between leading his troops into tactical mass slaughter. Even if you agree that the system deserves to be overthrown and that all of these humans deserve to die at his hands, which I can't blame you for considering the show's done nothing to endear you to any of them over the course of its run, yet tries to portray their final scenes dramatically as if you could possibly give a fuck, does that somehow make him righteous or interesting? All he does in the plot is kill hundreds of people and give speeches about how human society is bad. Like, no shit, that's kind of the entire fucking point of the show. Squealer is only relatable because he states what any casual observer would about the state of affairs in the show's universe. Are we really meant to regard him as a hero for that? Even weirder, the series ends with him dying horribly and then sort of suggesting that because Saki has empathy for the monster rats and is the leader of the village now, maybe things will get better in the future. Never mind that it gives no indication whatsoever of any changes that she intends to implement. The presentation of Saki's empathy is wildly inconsistent across the show too. It's implied right from the beginning that she cares more for the monster rat's feelings than others do because she sees that they have the same needs and emotions as people, yet in the final episode she acts like she's got no idea what Squealer is talking about, even though she's basically been saying the same shit all along. It's only after she and Satoru discover that the monster rats were humans all along that she finally shows him sympathy, which to me seemed entirely besides the point. Why should it matter if they're humans? They're sentient creatures with something to contribute to society. The fact that they should have been treated as equals was self-evident in the fact that Squealer could even demand such a thing. What about this ending is meant to offer me reassurance that Saki will make anything better? Perhaps the single most disappointing element of Shin Sekai Yori though is how it totally wastes the talents of a frankly embarrassing number of creative staff on these half-assed artistic breakaway scenes, which even start to dry up in the second half. Every so often there will suddenly be a random cut with some extra movement-heavy animation for no fucking reason, just sandwiched between two of the common variety ass-tastic static shots which the show is mostly comprised of. But earlier on we would get all these backstory bits that jumped into wholly different aesthetics, all of which came off half-assed to me. My favorite aesthetic in the entire show was that of episode 10, which I immediately identified as having been storyboarded and directed by Kashurn Sin's director Shikeyasu Yamauchi, on account of it looking exactly like that show. But here's what the best animated clip from that episode looks like. And here's what any random fight scene from Kashurn Sin's looks like. But hey, Kashurn Sin's is a madhouse joint, and everyone knows they're the shit, right? Well, Shin Sekai Yori also has some animation cuts from the absurdly prolific Hironori Tanaka. If you thought these cuts from SSY looked a little familiar to you, they probably are. I first looked up Tanaka's name because of a fight scene he animated in another Shigeyasu Yamauchi show from JC staff which no one remembers, called Yumekui Mary. Here's the task that show put him to. See, it's not just that Shin Sekai Yori is boring and ugly and lifeless, it's that anything unique or creative which it tries to do is so half-assed and non-committal that you can easily find 1,000 places it's been done better, even by the same staff. And don't get me wrong, it was kind of a pleasant surprise to see this rather infrequent director pop up randomly, but only as much so as it was a sad realization that I would never bother to look at this work again because it's trapped in the middle of fucking Shin Sekai Yori.
It's animation. It's animation. It's animation. It's animation. It's animation.
Look, I could easily spend the next 10 hours breaking down every single thing that bothered me about this show. Like how in the first exposition dump they explain that in this society, children are conditioned to use sexual contact as a means of curbing stress and aggressive tendencies, but since they've done nothing whatsoever to communicate that in the show so far, and this scene is comprised entirely of reused footage, they just toss in whatever moments of basic physical contact they've shown in the series so far, and then in the very next episode, the characters are suddenly all over each other in a way that would have seemed completely out of place had we not just had this aspect of their society explained. And then a few episodes after that, we're treated to basically an entire episode of the most awkward, least sensual looking sexual contact I've ever witnessed in anime. At least the manga incarnation had the decency to just be porn, and with vastly superior artwork to the TV series on top of that. But I've gotta stop somewhere, so let me leave you with this. In the fall season of 2012, Studio A1 Pictures had two shows running simultaneously, Sword Art Online and Shin Sekai Yori. Over the years, I have very infamously ragged on this studio, and especially on SAO, to such an extent that I created an entire culture of people shitting on the series as a way to get easy views on YouTube. In this time, it has often been posited to me that Studio A1 Pictures couldn't possibly deserve the ire I've given them because, while SAO might have been terrible, at least they were airing the masterpiece Shin Sekai Yori alongside of it. Back in my first ever Sword Art Online video from 2014, I suggested that the show would have been a 3 out of 10 for me if not for some egregiously awful scenes dragging the quality down. In retrospect, I found myself bumping that show's score up from a 1 to closer to a 2 because of having completed even worse shows over time, and finding myself continually fascinated by the few things which SAO got right. One of those is Kirito's motivations, to live his life inside of a virtual world wherein he can push himself to learn and grow in ways that day-to-day society doesn't allow for. Central to Kirito's involvement in the story is his ability to relate to the death game's creator, Kayaba, who became so obsessed with showing people how to live inside of a virtual world that he went full asshole and just trapped a shitload of people inside. After escaping the game world, Kirito becomes fascinated with trying to advance this technology and to explore its potential for helping humanity, with hopes of utilizing AR to integrate reality and virtual reality in more practical ways, which he apparently does, given that Excel World takes place in exactly the future which he was hoping for and is canonically a shared universe sequel. This thematic backdrop is barely explored at all within the series, but at least the logic behind it is solid, and it actually seems like a prescient and practical expectation for humanity's near future, which isn't presented too retardedly at the base level. Shin Sekai Yori's idea for the future is that we will need a culture of love in order to maintain life in a world where any one person is powerful enough to destroy the world, which is basically just a slight extension of the world we already live in. There's a scene wherein the village chief describes something even scarier than a nuclear bomb called humans, and I'm just like, humans were already the scary part of nuclear bombs. Nuclear bombs don't just launch themselves, you know? The whole situation we're in right now is that we're all trying to learn how to be empathetic and understanding of others while sussing out the best way forward for humanity, because just killing the people you disagree with doesn't work anymore in a world with mutually assured destruction looming overhead. Shin Sekai Yori is just a more extreme version of the reality we live in, wherein the destructive capabilities of even individuals are pushed far enough that we're forced to reshape society much more quickly and completely to deal with them. But what it ultimately has to say about that society is that if you build it, but you do it wrong, then it's not gonna work, guys! Well, no shit. But there is one theme in Shin Sekai Yori which I actually liked, and it's the only one which the show doesn't explicitly explain in the dialogue but was probably at the heart of its intentions, which is the way that when you're a child, society appears to be this big, scary, all-knowing, all-controlling machine that understands everything. And then you grow up and realize it's actually just a totally dysfunctional safety net full of massive holes run by a bunch of ignorant dipshits trying their best by following whatever script they've been given. The only reason this theme falls apart is that the dysfunctions within this society are things which should be obvious to anyone who was able to maintain that society in the first place. But when your premise is that the people running society are a bunch of dumbasses, I guess it's hard to argue with them fucking everything up. After all, this is a future wherein we managed to kill 98% of the population, so its view on human empathy is already pretty bleak. If I had to choose one of these shows to try and salvage with a rewrite, I would pick SAO in a heartbeat. Never mind that I plotted an entire rewrite like 3 years ago. I think there's a lot you could do with that show's themes without even replacing any of the characters or their motivations or changing anything about the setting. You just need to redouble the focus on exploring the different ways that people find to live in this virtual world, as well as the emotional journey of Kirito trying to find confidence in himself to embrace his natural leadership capabilities, form connections, and grow up into someone who can find a way to alter the use of this technology into something that helps people, but, you know, on screen. In the case of Shin Sekai Yori, while the core ideas are worth considering, the entire conceit of its setting is fundamentally senseless and couched in a negative view of humanity, presenting a world which can only be saved by the one person who just happens to be more empathetic and sensible than the others for no reason. I'm sure that it wouldn't be impossible to retool the basic aesthetic and social ideas of the series into something that kind of resembles it while making more sense, but you'd have to radically alter the motivations of every character in order to create something even slightly interesting. Suffice it to say that Shin Sekai Yori sits right next to the Asterisk War on the list of the absolute worst anime that I've ever watched to completion. It is trite, obnoxious, ugly, and more than anything, excruciatingly boring. 1 out of 10.
さき、そろそろ行こうか。
Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got a 3 p.m. appointment with some new show called Darling in the Franxx. Apparently, my favorite studio, Trigger, is making it, and everyone's telling me that they'd love to hear my thoughts on it. Stick around on my channel for more anime talk in the future, and support me on Patreon if you like my shit. Also, use all the links below to find about 1 million more hours of me talking. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. More like shit Sakai boring, am I right?